Turkey's role in the Middle East is facing renewed scrutiny as questions grow over its ties to groups like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. A new report from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies raises concerns among NATO allies about Ankara's positioning, arguing that under President Erdogan, the country has moved away from its traditional Western alignment and toward a deeper engagement with Islamist movements. To break it down, we are joined now by Dr. Sinan Sidi, one of the lead authors behind this new report and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Sinan, thanks for being with us this evening. At the heart of your report, what are the most concerning findings when it comes to Turkey's links to Hamas and to the Muslim Brotherhood?
Hi there, good evening. Yes, I mean, it's such a long report. It's quite wordy and it's quite dense, both in terms of content and in terms of recommendations that we have for the United States government. But the Hamas component is well documented and well researched, and it draws on existing, but as well as more up-to-date sort of information about all the ties that the government of Turkey does have with Hamas. But in addition to that, we've tried to document in the open source realm all the significant ties that Turkey has maintained and continues to maintain with leading figures of the Muslim Brotherhood. We've noted two notable individuals in there that we just draw your attention. We have one essentially Yemeni national, of senior leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, who's been able to, until his death, was allowed to reside in Turkey, but has been involved and implicated in significant ideological development of the Brotherhood's narrative, to the extent that he was thought to be a thought leader behind Osama bin Laden's thinking. And another individual whose brother was linked to the assassination of Anwar Sadat back in the day. And all of these individuals who are associated with the Brotherhood aren't just sort of being hidden or living undercover. They live under the protection and broad daylight, or lived under the broad protection and daylight with the Turkish government, and in open residences and throughout the country unhindered.
Well, Turkey is a NATO member, so how unusual is it for an ally to be associated with these groups that many in the West designate as terror organizations? What does this mean for a NATO member like Turkey?
It's highly unusual, and there has been no attempt, to my sort of observation, to try and hold Turkey to account on this. The sad truth is this. You know, both Turkey's European allies as well as the United States are fully aware of these entanglements and how deeply Turkey is entrenched with these organizations and entities. But there is a willingness to look the other way. I mean, if that sounds all a bit strange, just look at how willing the United States and Europe was for decades to basically overlook the danger, the growing danger that Iran continued to present the region as well as world security, until recent actions to essentially undermine it took place. So what Turkey has is very unusual in this realm. And I would also say, look, Turks inside of Turkey, when presented with this report, have just basically been following the social media traffic as well as the mainstream media traffic from Turkey that's looked at this report. And rather than question a government in Turkey which has enabled entanglement and relationships and association with jihadist and terrorist entities, such as the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots, and hold the government accountable and Erdogan accountable and say, how can you do this to us? All the arrows and all the hatred is directed at the organization here that has pointed this out. It's quite unusual and quite incredible that a lot of citizens in Turkey would essentially like to sort of shoot the messenger, so to speak, as opposed to hold the source accountable.
Well, speaking of holding the source accountable, when it comes to these Western countries like the United States that are turning a blind eye, what would it take for them to actually push for more action from Turkey, even push Turkey perhaps to even get out of NATO? Or what does Turkey bring to the table then for these Western countries to continue to turn a blind eye?
I mean, look, getting Turkey out of NATO is is a non-starter. I mean, every member of NATO, once you're in, you're in. There's no mechanism to do that. I mean, most European countries are very loath to hold Erdogan to account and say, hey, put a stop to these things, because, look, Turkey basically threatens the alliance and the transatlantic alliance, especially the European allies, with migratory flows that they would refuse to enforce and police. And in Washington, for some strange reason that eludes me up until this point, the Trump administration is willing to overlook, or at least essentially just put to one side, Turkey's entanglements. I mean, just look at the Iran conflict. We saw, President Trump sort of criticize U.S. allies and NATO allies for not doing anything to undermine the Islamic Republic in Iran, simply because, they're not pulling their weight, and they would be the first ones to want to work with a new Iran post-regime, but they're not doing anything. Consider a country like Turkey. Turkey's been spared this criticism, but if you look on the other side of the ledger, Turkey has a considerable amount of assets which it could bring that could help the, not necessarily the war effort, but look at Turkey's sizable navy, look at its sizable mine-clearing operations that could essentially ensure the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. And Turkey's not willing to do utilize any of their assets to do this. But on the other hand, we've grown tired of a Turkey constantly demanding things from the United States, such as F-35s, engines for their new indigenous fifth-generation fighter aircraft. They want sanctions lifted. And we've also seen the Trump administration, make disappear the single largest lawsuit which implicated the single largest violations of Iran sanctions by any country in the world, which was the Halkbank case. And in return, Turkey's not really doing anything other tthan sort of, shopping around their foreign minister, pretending that they're an interested party in ending the so-called, warmongering against Iran.
A very enlightening report that hopefully does gain some more traction. Dr. Sinan Sidi, thanks for being with us on I-24 News today to share more.
Thank you for having me.